this Alabama court ruling. Is actually three couples. There was an accidental dropping of a tray of embryos, and the embryos were destroyed and in the lab. And Alabama law, the Alabama the municipal court at first dismissed it. They said this is not an issue, but then the couples brought it to the Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court, which is charged with upholding the law, which in Alabama state law currently recognizes that every human child, regardless of their location, and in this case, one of the left's sort of taglines that they've glommed onto is this extrauterine child that the court came up with. Extrauterine children are worthy of legal constitutional protections because under Alabama law, life begins at conception, and whether that happens in the mother's womb or in the petri dish, they are worthy of the same protection. So, in fact, the court upheld this. And I think, like I said, one of the reasons why this has sparked so much of a firestorm is because Democrats see this as a winning political issue, right? They see this, they understand that, I mean, over 85%, the stats say, of Americans approve of IVF. They see it as a way to build families, to help couples struggling with the terrible cross of infertility, which is a real suffering for many couples. And so emotionally, the Democrats understand that emotionally they have the American people on their side here, just as we saw. And I would tie this, to similar outcomes we saw with with abortion measures in Kansas and Michigan, Ohio. The Democrats see that attacks on human life are a winning issue for them, and so this is a great way to bring IVF will be banned everywhere in the United States because you can't recognize these embryos as children, because if you recognize that, then oh my gosh, well then abortion's murder, right? They understand the stakes, and I think Catholics also, because of our rich intellectual tradition, we understand the stakes in recognizing
Let me
frozen embryos
let
as
me
humans.
let me
Yeah, go
press you on
ahead.
that. Let me
Go
press you
for
on
it.
that to start. So what are the stakes?
Yeah, so I think the stakes with IVF, if you have a legal system that recognizes that life begins at conception, then you are suddenly faced with the reality that we have over 1 million human lives in frozen stasis in the United States. And if you get a court saying those are human lives with constitutional protections, suddenly you've opened up this can of worms that's saying, these frozen embryos are deserving of
They're
something, of
humans, right?
dignity.
What should we
They're
do? And
humans.
right.
Yeah, which we've been saying, the Catholic Church has been saying since the beginning of time. um, but the left understands that they can now say, oh, the court said that these are humans. Oh, well, this is going to end IVF, and that's going to kickstart this emotional reaction with the American people. Um, and it's been fascinating watching pro life Americans and conservative Americans try to grapple with this ruling because unless you have the consistent principle that, yes, these are human persons and deserving of protections, you're left with this sort of vague, okay, what are we going to do with all these frozen embryos?
Now, we can have a debate as a society whether or not IVF should be legal or not. I would, of course, love it for it to be illegal because I think it's patently obvious that it's immoral to create human life in a petri dish. And of course, the problem with it, when you do it, you end up creating a lot more lives than you need. And there's selective reduction, as they like to call it, in the womb. And then also the ones that are put in basically a freezer. And it's a lot. It's the kind of thing that people don't really like to talk about a lot. One of the reasons they don't like to talk about it is because you feel your heart goes out for people who are infertile, and you want to figure out what, you want them to have children, and I mean, it's obviously my wife and I have been blessed with 6 children. We didn't have any fertility problems. My heart goes out to those people that have that situation. I talked to somebody just, today who said, hey, look, you really should we could use this as a moment to talk to couples and let them know there are other things like NAPRO that understand, what it is about the woman's fertility, and work with that and try to help along that, and can find out, hey, wait a minute. And now they've got like 5 kids, and it worked out well for them, and they didn't have to do IVF for anything artificial. It was just understanding the way the body worked a little bit better. So there are fertility treatments that don't get this moral quandary of IVF. Trump is like, "Hey, people want babies. IVF is the pro-life position." That's not true. What's going to happen is the legislature in Alabama is probably going to pass a law within the next few weeks and make sure that everyone knows that IVF is perfectly fine in Alabama. So what can we do as pro-life Catholics to try to respond to this moment? Well, I think first of all, preaching to the choir actually is a good thing. So what we can do is let other Catholics know actually IVF is morally problematic. In fact, the church considers it to be wrong and evil. And there are, by the way, much better ways. And let me tell you about some of these better fertility treatments. And then what we can try to hope for is the next time we get a president in the White House who's pro-life, get that president to say, now, I'm not saying you should, tackle this issue head on. I'm not saying you should try to make it illegal. I realize that that's probably not in the cards for a while, or for the foreseeable future. But what we can at least do is find out what's going on here. I mean, we have these IVF companies that are making millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and we have no idea what their procedures are, the regulations are. It's just sort of a wild west.
Right. I think one of the first steps is to draw attention because so little is known. I know some of the people on our politics staff, they were looking it up, and there's so little information about this industry. And it was really fascinating for me to dig in a little bit into the way that the European countries approach this. And again, I believe with the church that IVF is the commodification of the human person. It is immoral, but like you said, Josh, it is not in the cards right now for us to have anything more than an incremental approach. So I think that educating people about the fact that we are in the wild west of the fertility industry here, and that other countries that we often try to emulate as Americans, they don't see it that way. So I was looking up some of the regulations in the European countries. So in America, there's no limit on the number of embryos you can conceive, quote unquote, in the petri dish. There's no limits on, how long you store them, how the storage facilities are regulated. It really is just left to the companies, which treat these embryos as commodities, or in the case of Alabama now, liabilities, and really cash cows. But if you go to European countries, you'll see regulations like in France, you can only create 2 embryos at a time. That's it. And then you implant both of them. In Spain is the highest number you can do at once, and it's 3. Like, there are reasonable, and part of the reason why Europe regulates it so highly is because they recognize the emotional stakes, the political stakes, and they're like, okay, this is, I mean, it's Orwellian, really, or not Orwellian. Let's go with Huxleyan, more Aldous Huxley than Orwell. So it's really interesting, and I think starting to educate Americans on something that we don't really talk about that much because of the emotional baggage, it could be a step forward for pro-life Americans trying to make their way in a post-sexual revolution America.
For most Catholics who haven't gone through the IVF process, don't really have a grasp on what the American industry is like. But like I found an article of someone basically saying, yes, I'm a converted Catholic. I went through the IVF process. She said the doctor retrieved 38 good eggs. 31 of them were fertilized. Over the next week, 16 of our children, embryonic children, die and are discarded. 13 are cryogenically frozen, mostly 2 to a vial. 2 fresh embryos are transferred to my uterus. And then the babies ended up miscarrying as it was at 21 weeks gestation. And half the babies didn't survive thawing. I mean, just take a step back from all of this. Like, this is almost like it almost feels like a Star Wars conversation, like that technology would get to the place where you're watching your children die in a petri dish. It's like science fiction almost. Talk about just something horrible to even put a couple through.
I wish it were fiction.
Right. I wish it were fiction as well. But just like the problem with IVF in my eyes is there's never any addressing of the biological reality of a woman's cycle. It's just completely circumventing that, going towards really intense, expensive medical intervention process. And you never really work with a woman in a collaborative way to understand the root causes of why you might not be able to have children. And so that's what's so cool about NAPRO. And I'm speaking from personal experience here. Like I have been around women who were terrified of their own body because they didn't understand it because they had irregular cycles or different things.
They saw
And
it as
so
defective, right?
totally
Yeah.
saw themselves as the problem,
Mhm.
and talk about like an empowering experience to be able to teach a woman how to understand their own body, understand it as natural, be able to regulate it properly, and then you're not only going to be able to be have a better chance at fertility, but also be a lot healthier personally. So that to me just seems like, and this it exists, right? Anyone could do this tomorrow, but I don't think a lot of people really know about that outside of really like Catholic circles, I guess.
We discussed nutrition several on the Loopcast many months ago, and one of the points that you made, Pogo, is that good eating, right? Just eating normal stuff like vegetables and meat and proteins, that kind of stuff, is good for humans. But it doesn't make corporations money like potato chips,
Don't get
you
me
know,
started, Josh.
and snacks, right? And snack
Yep.
foods and sugary pop, right? That's what makes them money. Therefore, they're going to push that, right? Like who's going to do commercials on the Super Bowl saying "Eat vegetables, yay"? It's like no one's making money on that, so they're not going to do it. Well, this is the same thing with regards to this. Even if somehow IVF were not immoral, which it is immoral, but even if somehow it wasn't, companies would still be pushing it because there's a lot more profit in there than there is simple fertility awareness or some of these other fertility methods like NAPRO are aren't as really that big of a moneymaker per se. Do you see what I mean? So there is that element that's kind of underwriting this. It's like, all those movies like about, all the president's men, Watergate, follow the money, follow the money. You know something? Maybe some of these young women should start to ask themselves, why is it that these companies and these industries are pushing me this way? Is it for my own benefit, or is it perhaps that they want to make a ton of money?
I think it's also worth asking, just as Catholics, how we're doing with couples struggling with infertility. And I saw Nighthawk had thrown up on the screen there a story that I found at Femme Catholic about this one couple's struggle with the Catholic Church's teaching, and they were so pained by the infertility, their inability to conceive, that they went down the IVF road, and eventually came back around when they experienced for themselves the commodification of their bodies and their children, and starting to see each other, that this isn't just, I mean, we talk a lot about as Catholics about the sexual act, the conjugal act being procreative, but also they begin to recognize that when you separate the procreation of children from the sexual act, you also start to damage the unitive aspect of that act that brings a couple together, as a man and a woman. And she said that, eventually after, their embryos were transferred out of state because of some policy change and she was just brokenhearted. She finally went to her priest. And what turned her around was that the priest, with much compassion, said to her, "Look, the problem with IVF," and I'm quoting, "is that it treats babies as commodities rather than human beings. IVF is a business and babies are the product." And she goes, it's a very beautiful reflection. I'll drop it in the show notes. And she said, "All I know is that IVF unsettles me. They're not pursuing that anymore. But please pray for me and all couples walking through infertility." And this is her prayer: "May my desire for you, God, be greater than my desire for a child." And I just thought it was a beautiful reflection there.
I just want to though add on one thing here though. Like, while I'm happy that the priest compassionately gave her the truth, and that is to be commended, I can't help but just ache a little bit because wouldn't that woman have benefited from knowing what the church stood on this issue beforehand? And how would she have known?
See, that's interesting. One of her points though is she had read the document, she's trained in theology, but their desire for children, that this is my purpose as a woman, this is was it overcame that intellectual knowledge.
Yes, but theology should not just be an exercise that's private between you and the documents that you're reading, even with you and your spouse, let's say, in the documents that you're reading. Again, I'm not trying to harp on, I mean, I'm thankful that the priest was compassionate and presented the truth, those are what were required. It's just that it would be helpful if we had a church where this was a regular thing and taught, promulgated from popes, priests, bishops, all throughout the whole church that, hey, look, I know people are struggling with this. I mean, here's an opportunity. This came up in the news now. There's a document that Ratzinger wrote before he became pope that's actually very phenomenal on this. But I just, again, it's one thing. It can't be just like well, we did write this piece of paper in 1986 discussing this. Like, yes, look, I get it. But like, there are couples every month that are going through this anguish and they're thinking, well, is this the solution for me? Should I think about this? It shouldn't only be Catholic websites going through and explaining to people, actually, you know what? You really shouldn't do this. We love you, compassion, truth. That's good. I'm glad we have that. We need that. But it would be nice to have a little bit more of an ecclesiastical response because it is painful. It is a touchy subject. But if it's never brought up, then how are people going to know? Not everyone has a theology degree or whatever, like this lady does. They're not well versed in it. They're looking to the church for guidance.
So Josh, if I could schoolhouse rock this real quick, because let's just say, for the sake of this hypothetical, the church has done a good enough job so that there's a decent amount of Catholics that just in no situation would ever advise IVF, understand it to be immoral, would never advocate for it publicly or in law, etc. We're talking about an issue that garners 80 to 85% of public support. People see Trump say, I'm pro IVF, we're pro more children. What do you think the best way for Catholics to approach this debate in an effective manner today to be?
Well, what's going to happen is the state of Alabama, the legislature there is going to debate what to do about this ruling, and they're going to, I'm almost sure of it, within a few weeks, pass a law, and the governor will sign it, that will make it clear that couples who are struggling to have children can use IVF. I mean, IVF is now kind of on halt in Alabama because of the court ruling. So I'm not trying to say that's not changing anything. But my point is, what can we do? We can educate people about why we have serious concerns because it is immoral. We think it preys on infertile couples. We don't think we think there are better fertility treatments that respect human life. Ultimately, what we can try to do is convince lawmakers to make it a better bill, reform it or whatever. I would hope that they don't establish in law that life begins at implantation, which is one way they might just try to get away from this. That way, IVF would be
I think
perfectly fine. I mean,
that's the hill to die on, I think.
Yeah.
You
Yeah. I
can't
mean, the
ever.
thing is, you can still pass a bill like this without surrendering the principle. So we'll see what happens. This is the debate that we're going to have to chip away at for a long time.
Politics is the art of getting stuff done. So just because Trump isn't there yet on this issue doesn't mean, okay, we all have to jump ship and now we just let Biden run again for 2024. So it's like, my issue with this is when people come to me like that, it's like, yeah, he's not perfect. Of course. Have you ever seen anything problematic that he's done? Like, yes, we all have seen it.
Well, and I think too, just our experience of Trump v. Biden in terms of someone who is willing to negotiate, concede, compromise, make a point. Like, I have much more hope that with Trump in the White House, we could actually have a conversation about regulating the IVF industry and at least make some gains in that direction. Under Biden, there is no question there would never be any kind of concessions there. So again, understand. Yeah, politics, art of doing of finding what's possible, getting it done.